Emily arrived at the lake house just after sunset, the sky painted in soft pink and fading gold. She had been here many times before, but tonight felt different. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself was waiting for someone to speak the truth hidden for years. She stepped inside slowly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Ethan had sounded strange on the phone earlier, and she still could not shake the sense that something important was about to happen. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by old books, scattered papers, and boxes that had never been unpacked. The warm light from the lamps cast shadows across his face, making him look more tired, more thoughtful than usual. He greeted her with a quiet smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and she knew something was weighing on him. "Thanks for coming," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't want to go through all this alone tonight." Emily nodded, pushing a small smile onto her face even though she felt the tension too. "Of course, Ethan," she replied gently. "You know I'd always show up if you needed me." They started sorting the books in silence, working through the shelves that had been untouched for years. Dust rose with every movement, catching the warm light like tiny glowing particles. Emily tried to focus on the task, but she kept glancing at Ethan, watching the way he moved slower than normal, like something heavy sat inside his chest. He barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was low, slow, almost distant. He kept looking toward the door, as if waiting for someone to leave or someone to come back. Emily knew Ethan's relationship with his father was complicated, but she didn't understand why tonight felt so much harder for him. Finally she broke the silence. "Did something happen?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. She wanted him to know he didn't have to hide anything from her. Ethan paused with a photo frame in his hand. It was a picture of him as a child, sitting by the same lake behind the house. His father stood behind him with a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that seemed warm but strict at the same time. Ethan stared at the picture for a long moment before setting it down carefully. "I'm fine," he answered at first, but the way his eyes flickered away told her the truth was deeper. Emily took a step closer, studying his face, noticing the tension around his jaw and the worry in his eyes. "You don't look fine," she whispered. And he let out a small laugh, but it wasn't happy. It was more like he was trying to release pressure that had been building for too long. The wind outside grew stronger, brushing against the wooden walls, making the house feel even more isolated. It was quiet in a way that made every emotion sharper, almost too clear to ignore. Emily sat on the arm of the couch and watched Ethan as he continued picking up old frames and notebooks without really seeing them. She had known him for 10 years, known his calm nature, his gentle humor, his ability to make everyone around him feel steady, but tonight there was something different in the way he moved, something fragile beneath the surface, something he had been trying to hide for years. Ethan walked to the window and stared out at the lake, the dark water reflecting the last bit of evening light. "My dad just left," he said suddenly, not turning around. "He's on his way to the city, business trip. Maybe he'll be back tomorrow." Emily frowned, sensing that this information mattered more than he made it sound. "Why does that feel important?" she asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He kept staring into the darkness outside, as if searching for courage in the quiet night. Emily stepped closer, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't explain. She felt something in the air, like a moment waiting to happen, a truth standing right behind his silence. Finally Ethan turned, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. It wasn't fear and it wasn't sadness, it was something deeper, something that made the room feel warmer all at once. He walked toward her slowly, each step carrying a weight she didn't understand yet. "Emily," he said softly, almost like a confession already beginning. "I need to tell you something now that he's gone." Her heartbeat skipped, and she tightened her fingers around the side of the couch. Ethan rarely looked this vulnerable. His voice trembled slightly, and Emily suddenly realized she hadn't seen him this open before, not in all the years they had been close. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. He hesitated, lowering his gaze for a moment before lifting it again. This time there was a truth in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Emily could feel her pulse racing, not out of fear, but out of something warm and unexpected, something she had never let herself imagine clearly. Ethan took a deep breath, like he was preparing to reveal something that had lived inside him for too long. His hands shook just slightly, enough for Emily to notice, enough for her to feel her own nerves rising with his. "I've been holding something in," he said slowly. "Something I couldn't say while my father was here because he always expects me to be someone I'm not." Emily froze, confusion and concern blending inside her. She had known Ethan struggled with his father's strict expectations, but she never thought it affected him this deeply, not like this, not in a way that made him look as if he was standing on the edge of a life-changing moment. "What are you trying to tell me?" she asked softly, stepping closer without realizing it. Ethan looked at her with an expression she could only describe as longing, quiet but powerful, the kind that made her breath hitch. It was a look she had never seen him give her before, at least not so openly. "I didn't want to say this in front of him," he whispered. "Because he wouldn't understand, he never does, and I didn't want him to see how much it matters to me." Emily's stomach tightened with emotion she wasn't ready to name. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, more intimate. The soft glow of the lamps brushed across their faces, highlighting the tension building between them, tension she didn't know existed until now. Ethan stepped even closer, close enough that Emily could feel the warmth from his chest, close enough that she had to lift her gaze to meet his properly. "I need you to hear this," he said. "Because it's been inside me too long." Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She could feel the truth coming. She could feel the moment tightening like a pulled string, one breath away from snapping open. Every part of her wanted to know what he had been hiding, even as fear whispered that the answer might change everything between them. Ethan took another slow breath, his chest rising and falling with tension she felt through the air. He opened his mouth to speak, his eyes holding hers, full of something intense and unspoken, but before he could finish, his phone buzzed loudly. They both jumped slightly, breaking the quiet intensity of the moment. Ethan pulled the phone out and answered with a frustrated tone. Emily watched him closely, trying to read the shift in his expression. After a brief conversation, Ethan lowered the phone and exhaled deeply. "My dad left the city already," he murmured. "He won't be back until late tomorrow." He looked at her again, this time with determination, like the truth he was about to reveal had been waiting for this exact moment. Emily's pulse quickened. She felt like she was standing at the beginning of something she did not yet understand but desperately wanted to. Ethan walked toward her deliberately, each step bringing his emotions closer to the surface. Emily felt her knees weaken just slightly, her breath shallow as she met his gaze. His vulnerability reached her in a way that warmed her chest, a way she had never felt with anyone else. "Emily," he whispered, "now that he's gone, I need to tell you something." Her heart pounded, the moment stretching between them like a fragile thread. She braced herself, gripping the edge of the table beside her, because she sensed the truth he carried was big enough to change everything. Ethan inhaled slowly, his eyes locked onto hers with a mix of fear and longing, and then he finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, carrying years of emotion in just a few words. But whatever he said in that moment was nothing Emily expected, and it was only the beginning. Emily stood still, her breath caught halfway in her chest, as Ethan's words settled between them like warm embers slowly spreading through the room. The moment felt fragile, almost unreal, like one of those scenes where time moved slower just so the truth could finally be spoken without interruption. Ethan's confession was not just a statement, it was an entire world he had been holding inside himself for years, and now he had cracked it open in front of her. He stepped back slightly, not to create distance but to breathe, as if releasing the weight of the truth made him lightheaded. "I didn't want to say any of this while my dad was here," he murmured, running a shaky hand through his hair. "Because he always makes me feel small, like my feelings don't matter, like I shouldn't want anything that doesn't fit his plan for me." Emily felt a tug in her heart. She had always known Ethan's relationship with his father was rigid and demanding, but she had not realized how deeply it silenced the softer parts of him, the parts he rarely showed anyone. She stepped closer, a quiet reassurance in her movement, letting him know she wasn't backing away from his honesty. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed, not in shame but in exhaustion. "He wants me to be the perfect son," he continued. "Strong, confident, successful, someone who never hesitates, never shows weakness, never." He paused, swallowing hard. "Never feels the way I feel about you." The air shifted again, heavier and warmer. Emily's hands trembled slightly at her sides, not from fear but from the overwhelming emotion rising inside her. Hearing the words she had never expected to hear from him, not out loud, not in the quiet of this dim room with the wind brushing against the windows, she sat down across from him, but not too far, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "Ethan," she whispered, wanting to comfort him, but not knowing if touching him would break him or steady him. "You don't have to hold anything in with me." He lifted his gaze slowly, and the look in his eyes made her heart twist. It was soft, wounded, hopeful, and scared all at once, the kind of expression someone wears when they have waited a long time to speak their truth. "I've tried so many times to ignore it," he said, voice unsteady. "I kept telling myself it would go away, that it was just a phase, but every time I saw you again it grew stronger." Emily felt her pulse race, like the room had shifted closer around them, tightening the space between their breaths. She had always felt something special around Ethan, something calm and steady, something that lingered even after she left his side, but she never allowed herself to imagine that it went this deep, this real, this vulnerable. Ethan continued, looking at his hands as if the truth was written there. "Every time you laugh, Emily, everything in me changes," he said, his voice carrying a tenderness that made her chest ache. "Every time you walk into a room I notice, even when I try not to, even when I force myself to look away, it doesn't work, I can't turn it off." Emily swallowed the tightness in her throat, feeling his words settle inside her like warm stones sinking gently into place. She wanted to speak, to tell him something comforting, something true, but her thoughts tangled together, her emotions overflowing faster than she could catch them. Ethan leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment as if releasing a breath he had held for years. "I didn't tell you all this because I was afraid of losing you," he admitted. "You're my closest friend, the only person who understands me without me having to explain anything. I couldn't risk ruining that." A soft ache bloomed in Emily's chest, tender and deep. "You wouldn't have lost me," she whispered, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Ethan opened his eyes, something hopeful flickering inside them. "I didn't know that," he said gently. "I didn't want to test it, and then every time I saw you with someone else, even if it was just friends, it felt like something inside me twisted, like I wasn't allowed to say what I felt, because I never gave you a chance to hear it in the first place." Emily looked down at her hands, trying to steady her breathing. She felt her heart pushing against her ribs, warm and intense, because his words were beginning to open up old emotions she had kept locked away, feelings she had tried to convince herself weren't real. To avoid making things complicated, Ethan leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, voice softer than before. "Tonight when you walked in, I realized I couldn't hide any longer. You were just standing there, smiling like you always do, and something in me said, 'Tell her now,' because I didn't want to spend another year pretending this wasn't real." Emily lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes fully, and, for the first time, she saw the depth of the longing he had carried. It was gentle but strong, kind but desperate, steady but trembling at the edges. She felt her breath catch again, the emotional weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She stood up slowly and walked toward him, her steps quiet but certain. Ethan watched her with a mixture of fear and hope, his eyes following every move she made. She sat down beside him this time, close enough that their knees brushed lightly, the small contact sending a soft warmth through her. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she asked softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Why wait until now?" Ethan looked at her as if the answer hurt to say. "Because I wasn't brave enough," he whispered. "And because I didn't want my father hearing any of it. He has a way of making me doubt everything I feel, but tonight when he left, something inside me finally felt free, like I could speak without hearing his voice in the back of my head." Emily listened carefully, understanding more than he realized. She knew how much pressure he lived under, how much he tried to hide the softer parts of himself just to be the son his father wanted. She felt protective of him in that moment, wanting to shield him from the years of quiet pain he had carried alone. "Ethan," she whispered, reaching out as if to touch his hand but stopping just short. "I wish you didn't feel like you had to hide from me." He looked down at her hand hovering near his, then gently turned his palm upward, letting her hand fall softly into his. The touch was warm, delicate, but filled with emotion that ran deeper than either of them had spoken before. Emily felt her breath shake slightly as their fingers intertwined. "I didn't want to lose you," he said again. "That fear kept me quiet more than anything." The room felt different now, as if it was holding them gently, giving them space to breathe and understand each other in a new way. The heater hummed softly in the background, its warmth blending with the heat rising between their joined hands. Emily felt her chest tightening with emotion she had held back for so long. She looked at his face, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way he seemed relieved but terrified at the same time, the way he held her hand like it was something fragile and precious. Before she could answer, before she could begin to unpack the feelings she had buried for years, a sudden creak from the front porch cut through the silence. They both froze, turning toward the door as footsteps approached. The calm moment shattered by the sound of someone arriving unexpectedly. The doorknob turned slowly, and the wooden door slid open, letting in a gust of cool night air. Ethan stood up quickly, still holding Emily's hand for a moment before letting go with clear reluctance. His eyes widened with surprise and frustration, the timing horribly cruel. Standing in the doorway was Ethan's older brother, Lucas, carrying a duffel bag over his shoulder, shaking snowflakes from his hair. He looked between them with confusion, sensing immediately that he had walked in on something important, something he didn't understand yet. "I thought Dad was still here," Lucas said slowly, narrowing his eyes as he studied the tense atmosphere. "What's going on?" Emily felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and emotion, while Ethan took a steady but tense breath, preparing to say something that would keep their moment intact, something that would hold the truth between them until it could be spoken again fully. But the interruption had already shifted everything, and Emily could see in Ethan's eyes that he was now fighting to protect a confession that had taken him years to finally release. And the night was far from over. The moment Lucas stepped inside the lake house, the air changed again, as if someone had opened a window and let the cold night slip straight into the warm and fragile moment that Emily and Ethan had just shared. Ethan stiffened at the interruption, frustration flickering across his face before he could hide it. Emily felt her heartbeat thumping loudly in her chest, not because Lucas had arrived, but because the confession she had waited years to hear had finally been spoken aloud, and now it hovered in the air like a delicate thing that could break if anyone touched it wrong. Lucas looked between them, sensing the strange tension, not understanding it fully, but knowing instantly he had walked into something he was not supposed to see. He dropped his bag on the floor with a dull thud and raised his eyebrows. "I didn't mean to interrupt anything," he said slowly, his gaze shifting from Emily's flushed face to Ethan's tense expression. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, trying to protect that soft moment that had barely begun. "Lucas, can you give us a minute?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Lucas hesitated, watching them for another second, then nodded and stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind him with a quiet thump that echoed through the stillness of the room. As soon as he disappeared, Ethan exhaled sharply, almost collapsing back onto the couch. Emily moved toward him, her chest tight with emotion and uncertainty. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering near his, unsure if she should grab it again or wait for him to reach out first. "Ethan," she whispered carefully, "it's all right, you didn't lose the moment, you didn't lose anything." He shook his head, pressing his palms together. "I hate that he walked in right then," he murmured. "I waited so long to say all of this, and the moment I finally open my heart, something interrupts." Emily reached for his hand, gently this time, giving him the chance to pull away if he needed space, but he didn't. Instead he held her hand tightly, as if grounding himself in the warmth of her touch. "We can start again," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere, not after everything you just told me." Ethan looked at her, his eyes softening with relief and something much deeper, something that made her pulse skip. "I meant every word," he whispered. "I didn't say it just because the house felt quiet or because my dad left. I said it because I've been holding those feelings for too long." Emily felt her throat tighten, the truth of his words sinking deeper than she expected. She had always seen Ethan as someone steady, strong in a quiet way, and watching him open up like this made her heart feel warm and vulnerable all at once. "And I've been holding mine too," she admitted in a trembling voice, surprising herself with how natural it felt to confess something she had locked away for years. Ethan blinked as if her words were something he didn't dare hope for, something he needed to hear but had convinced himself he never would. "You," he whispered breathlessly. "You felt something too." Emily nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around his. "I tried to ignore it," she said honestly. "Because you never showed anything and I didn't want to risk losing you, but every time you looked away from me too quickly, or every time you smiled at me like I mattered, it became harder to pretend." Ethan's shoulders relaxed, the tension melting away as though her words stitched a wound he didn't know could heal. He lifted his free hand and gently brushed a piece of hair away from her face, the touch soft and hesitant, as if afraid she might pull away. But she didn't. She leaned into his palm, letting the warmth settle against her skin. For a moment, the world felt small and perfect, just the two of them breathing in the same quiet air. But then a sudden vibration from Ethan's phone broke the spell again, vibrating loudly against the wooden table. Ethan glanced at the screen and his entire expression shifted, fear, frustration, and disbelief flashing across his features. "It's my dad," he whispered. Emily felt a cold rush in her chest. Already? She asked, her voice barely above a breath. Ethan swallowed hard and answered the call, keeping the phone pressed to his ear as he listened to the stern voice on the other end. His father spoke quickly, sharply, and Ethan's expression grew more burdened with every passing second. Finally Ethan lowered the phone, staring at the floor for a moment before meeting Emily's eyes. "He's turning around," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. "He's coming back tonight." The room seemed to inhale all at once, the quiet turning sharp. Emily felt her heart squeeze at the stress she saw in Ethan's eyes. "Does he know Lucas is here?" she asked carefully. Ethan shook his head. "No," he murmured. "But he wants to talk, he wants to make sure I'm handling things properly." Which is just another way of saying he wants to control everything again. Emily placed her hand on his shoulder, grounding him gently. "You don't have to go back to hiding," she said softly. "Not from him, not from me." Ethan looked at her with a kind of fear. That wasn't about rejection, but about losing the freedom he felt for the first time in years. "He always has a way of making me feel like nothing I want matters," Ethan whispered. "Like I should forget what I feel and focus on what he wants." Emily shook her head gently, leaning closer, her voice warm and steady. "But this," she said, squeezing his hand. "What you feel, what you told me, what we just shared, this matters. Ethan, it matters more than anything he can say." Ethan inhaled deeply, letting her words sink into him like air he had been deprived of. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Not of telling him, but of losing the courage to hold on to this." Emily moved closer, closing the space between them until she could rest her forehead against his breath warm against her lips. "You won't lose it," she whispered. "Because you're not holding it alone anymore." Ethan closed his eyes, letting the closeness steady him, letting her presence remind him that he wasn't the same quiet, silenced version of himself his father always saw. When he opened his eyes again, there was something new in them, not just longing or fear, but determination, gentle but real. "Emily," he said quietly, "I don't want this to disappear when he walks through that door." She smiled softly, her thumb brushing across the back of his hand. "Then it won't," she whispered. Ethan leaned in just slightly, not enough to cross any line, not enough to break any rules, but enough to let her feel the warmth of his breath, the closeness he had denied himself for so long, the quiet promise forming in the space between them. Before they could say anything else, Lucas stepped back into the room, clearing his throat nervously. He said, looking unsure. "Dad just called me too, he said he's 5 minutes away." Ethan and Emily pulled back just slightly, but their hands remained intertwined, neither of them letting go. Ethan looked at her with a fragile yet fierce clarity. "This is only the beginning," he whispered. Emily nodded, her eyes shining with the truth she had finally allowed herself to feel. "We face everything together now." And as footsteps approached the door, heavy and familiar, Emily and Ethan held on to each other, not with fear, but with the quiet, steady courage of two people who finally understood that the truth they shared mattered more than anything waiting on the other side of that door. The moment felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another, and nothing about it would ever be the same again.